Justice, the foundation of every courtroom, the promise that truth will always prevail. But what happens when the one who holds the gavel isn't seeking justice, but controlling it? And if the system itself is rigged, who will dare to stand against it? The courtroom was filled, yet the silence was suffocating. Under the cold glow of fluorescent lights, Elijah Carter sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together. His posture was rigid, his face composed, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't afraid of the charges against him. He was afraid because he knew the truth alone wasn't enough to set him free. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, as if justice itself had already abandoned him. Behind him, in the second row of seats, Naomi Carter watched in absolute stillness. She was an enigma among the spectators, clad in a fitted dark suit, her presence both commanding and unreadable. Unlike the others, she wasn't shifting uncomfortably in her seat, nor was she glancing nervously at the judge. Instead, she was watching, studying, calculating. No one in this room knew who she was. Not the prosecutor, not the defense attorney, not even the judge sitting high on the bench. But they would, because Naomi Carter hadn't come here just to watch her brother stand trial. She had come to change the outcome. Judge Lucas Whitmore leaned back slightly in his towering chair, a slow smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He exuded authority, not because he demanded it, but because the room had already surrendered to it. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He didn't even need to glare. Everyone already knew. His word was law. His reputation preceded him. A man of order. A judge who didn't tolerate excuses. But beneath that mask of judicial impartiality lay something far more insidious. Power. The kind that doesn't just decide cases, it decides fates. He was not simply a man who upheld the law. He was a man who controlled it. And today, like so many days before, he was confident, certain, that the outcome of this trial was already sealed. Then, for the briefest moment, his gaze landed on Naomi. And she met it. She did not flinch. She did not avert her eyes. She held his stare, unblinking, unreadable. Something about that unsettled him, just for a fraction of a second. Because unlike the others in this courtroom, she wasn't afraid of him. And Whitmore, though he would never admit it, recognized something dangerous in that. Some trials are just a formality, a procedure, a rubber stamp, a foregone conclusion. But then there are trials that will decide more than just one man's fate. This trial was never just about Elijah Carter. It was about something far greater. And whether Judge Lucas Whitmore knew it or not, this time, the game was about to change. The trial had only just begun, but for Elijah Carter, the verdict had been written long before he ever stepped into this courtroom. He sat at the defendant's table, his fingers curled against the polished wood, his breathing slow, deliberate, a man forcing himself to remain composed in a world where composure wouldn't save him. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't violent. He was a young black man who had made the mistake of asking the wrong question to the wrong officer on the wrong day. And now, here he was, charged with resisting arrest, a vague accusation as old as the system itself, one that had destroyed lives before his, one that could destroy his now. Across the courtroom, Naomi Carter sat motionless in the second row of seats. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't restless. She wasn't like the others watching this unfold. To them, she was just another concerned sister, her dark eyes unreadable, her face calm, detached. But Naomi Carter wasn't just here for her brother. She was here to change the outcome. Because Elijah wasn't just fighting a charge, he was fighting a system that had already decided he was guilty. And Naomi Carter wasn't about to let that happen. There was a stillness to Naomi, a kind that didn't come from fear, but from calculated control. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, observing everything, the way the prosecutor moved, the way the jury shifted in their seats, the way Judge Whitmore barely even looked at Elijah, as if he had already erased him. Naomi Carter had seen these kinds of men before, the ones who spoke of justice but had no interest in delivering it. But there was something they didn't know about her. Naomi wasn't just watching, she was waiting. Because the difference between her and everyone else in this room was that Naomi Carter wasn't just a sister fighting for her brother. She was a federal agent, and she had come prepared. Perched high above the courtroom, Judge Lucas Whitmore sat with his fingers drumming lightly against his bench, his face unreadable, his presence undeniable. Whitmore was not a man who needed to raise his voice to command a room. He had spent decades inside these walls, decades delivering verdicts, decades wielding power. To him, this was not a trial. It was a formality, the kind of case he had seen 100 times before, a young black man charged with resisting arrest. There were patterns to these things, and Whitmore understood those patterns better than anyone. He had built a career on them. To him, Elijah Carter wasn't a person. He was a case number, a statistic, another tally on a list no one would remember. And if there was one thing Lucas Whitmore was certain of, it was how this case would end. Or at least that's what he thought. Because what he hadn't accounted for was Naomi Carter. On the other side of the courtroom, Martin Graves adjusted the cuffs of his suit. He was younger than Whitmore, sharper, hungrier. This wasn't about justice for him. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about winning. Graves was still carving out his name in this city, and every conviction was another step up the ladder. Elijah Carter's case was nothing more than an opportunity, a chance to show that he was tough on crime, that he could get the job done. It didn't matter to him if the evidence was thin. It didn't matter if the charge was weak. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that mattered was the win, and Martin Graves never played to lose. Naomi watched Elijah as he sat staring straight ahead, his expression blank. But she saw the weight pressing down on him. The weight of knowing that no matter how much truth was on his side, the system was not. And that's where they made their mistake. Because Whitmore, Graves, the jury, they all assumed Naomi Carter was just another spectator. But they were wrong. She wasn't here just to watch. She was here to make sure, for the first time in his long, untouchable career, Lucas Whitmore lost. The air inside the courtroom was thick, not with justice, but with something far colder. Something rehearsed, manufactured. Naomi felt it the moment Martin Graves rose from his chair. Smooth, deliberate, the kind of confidence that didn't come from truth, but from certainty. He adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, then turned to face the jury. He was in control, or at least he thought he was. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Graves began, his voice even, unwavering. The voice of a man who had told this story many times before. "This case is about one simple truth, law and order." He took a measured step forward, letting the words settle in the air. The defendant, Elijah Carter, was given lawful commands by uniformed officers, commands that any law-abiding citizen would have followed without hesitation. He paused, his gaze shifting to Elijah, eyes narrowing slightly. But Mr. Carter made a choice, a deliberate choice, to resist, to escalate, to defy the very authority that keeps our streets safe. Naomi forced herself to remain still. It was always the same script, a different courtroom, a different black man, but the same rehearsed performance. Graves wasn't arguing facts, he was telling a story, one designed to make Elijah look like a threat. One designed to make the jury believe that this wasn't about justice, it was about control. The prosecution calls Officer Thomas Raines to the stand. The courtroom doors swung open, and Officer Raines stepped forward with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing he was protected. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, every movement practiced. He took his seat, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Naomi watched him carefully. This was where the real game began. Graves approached the witness stand, his tone light, almost casual, as if they were just having a conversation. "Officer Raines, can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Raines nodded. "Yes, sir. That evening, we responded to a disturbance near a gas station. When we arrived, we spotted the suspect, Mr. Carter, who fit the description given by the caller." Naomi's jaw tightened. Fit the description. The oldest trick in the book. A phrase vague enough to mean anything and precise enough to justify everything. Graves nodded approvingly. "And when you attempted to engage with the defendant, what happened?" Raines sat up straighter. "He immediately became aggressive." A ripple passed through the jury box. Graves turned slightly, his expression grave. "Planted the seed. Now time to water it." "Aggressive, you say? Can you clarify?" He raised his voice. His body language was hostile. He refused to comply with direct orders. Naomi's fingers curled into her lap. Every word was carefully chosen. Raised his voice instead of asked a question. Hostile body language instead of stood his ground. refused to comply instead of wanted to know why he was being stopped. And just like that, Elijah wasn't a person anymore. He was a threat, a statistic, a problem to be contained. Objection. The voice was steady, firm. Attorney Warren Douglas. Naomi turned her gaze toward the defense table, where Elijah's lawyer stood, a seasoned man, graying at the temples, but sharp, deliberate. The officer's statements are vague and speculative. Hostile body language is subjective and does not constitute aggression. Whitmore barely lifted his gaze. Overruled, Naomi watched the way Douglas's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He expected this. Whitmore had just confirmed what Naomi already knew. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about facts. This was about moving the pieces into place to secure the inevitable conviction. But Douglas wasn't finished. He straightened his jacket, stepped toward the witness stand, and looked Raines in the eye. "Officer Raines," he said smoothly, his voice controlled, calculated. "You testified that my client refused to comply with lawful commands. Tell me, what exact words did he use?" A beat of silence. Naomi saw it then, the flicker of hesitation in Raines' eyes. Raines shifted slightly in his seat. He asked why he was being stopped. Naomi felt her pulse slow. There it was, the truth, buried under a mountain of manufactured fear, but still there. Douglas nodded slowly. "And did he use profanity? Did he threaten you?" Raines swallowed. "No, sir." "Did he lay hands on you?" "No, sir." "So to be clear, the aggression you described was a man asking why he was being detained." Raines glanced toward Graves, searching for a lifeline, but there was none. The room was silent. "Objection." Graves' voice cut through the silence, his confidence faltering just slightly. "The defense is leading the witness." Whitmore didn't hesitate. Sustained. Douglas exhaled, stepping back, but Naomi knew he had made his point. The jury was listening now. The cracks had begun to show, and Graves knew it too. Naomi glanced toward Whitmore. For the first time since the trial began, he looked mildly interested, not concerned, not rattled, just watching, because he had been here before. He had seen cases slip through the cracks, and he had learned long ago how to seal those cracks shut before they could spread. Naomi met his gaze. Neither of them spoke. But in that moment, they both knew something the jury didn't. The real fight was only just beginning. This was not the first time Lucas Whitmore had presided over a trial like this. It would not be the last. But what he didn't realize was that Naomi Carter wasn't just here to fight for her brother. She was here to make sure he never did this again. Naomi had seen corrupt trials before. She had seen cases where the odds were stacked, where the outcome was written long before the first witness was called. But this was different. Judge Lucas Whitmore wasn't just biased. He wasn't even pretending to be fair. It was in the way he moved, the way he barely looked at Elijah, the way his rulings came down with effortless certainty, as if he was simply checking off a list rather than deciding a man's fate. He didn't just want Elijah convicted. He wanted everyone in this courtroom to understand that this was how things worked, that his word was law. Naomi recognized the tactic. She had seen it before in powerful men who thought they were untouchable. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about Elijah. It was about control. Whitmore wanted to send a message to Elijah, to the jury, to anyone who might think to challenge the system. This is my courtroom. You do not question the way things are. You do not resist. And if you do, you will lose. The worst part? He wasn't even trying to hide it. Each time Warren Douglas objected, Whitmore barely glanced up before overruling him. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't entertain arguments. He was playing a role he had perfected, the final authority, the unshakable force of the law. Naomi studied him closely. Whitmore wasn't an angry man. He wasn't reckless. No, he was far more dangerous than that. He was a man who believed in what he was doing, and that made him predictable. Whitmore wasn't just trying to convict Elijah. He was laying down an example. He wanted this to be a clean conviction, a lesson, a warning. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly predicted, was that Naomi Carter had come here with a message of her own. And he had chosen the wrong person to make an example out of. Naomi had spent years taking down men like him, men who confused power with righteousness, men who used the law as a weapon instead of a shield. And today, Judge Lucas Whitmore was about to learn a very simple lesson. A gavel might give a man power, but it did not make him untouchable. The moment Graves finished his closing remarks, the courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness. He adjusted his suit with slow precision, casting a knowing glance at the jury, as if the verdict had already been sealed. The weight of his words still hung in the air, shaping the narrative, bending the truth into something that fit neatly within his version of events. It was the perfect ending to a well-rehearsed performance. But Naomi Carter had never been one for scripted endings. She rose from her seat. The scrape of her chair against the polished floor cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. It was such a small sound, but it carried weight. Power. Elijah turned to her, confusion flashing across his face. The jury shifted. A few leaned forward slightly, uncertain whether this was part of the proceedings or something else entirely. Even Graves hesitated for half a second, his confidence momentarily thrown off course. And then, at the bench, Judge Lucas Whitmore looked up. For the first time that day, he really looked at her. His expression didn't change, but Naomi caught the flicker of something beneath the surface. Recognition, annoyance, calculation. Then came the smirk, slow, amused, patronizing. "Well now," he murmured, tapping his finger against the bench. "Looks like we have a new lawyer in the room. Miss Carter, is it?" He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or should I say, Attorney Carter?" A few chuckles rippled through the jury box. Graves folded his arms, regaining his composure, the smirk returning to his face as he observed the unexpected disruption. Naomi didn't blink. "I'm not a lawyer," she said evenly. She reached into her blazer, her movements unhurried, deliberate. Then, in one smooth motion, she pulled out her badge. A polished golden emblem gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. United States Secret Service. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room. The court reporter froze, fingers hovering above the keys. One juror inhaled sharply, his eyes flicking between Naomi and Whitmore. The bailiff took an unconscious step forward, instincts kicking in before he realized what he was doing. Even Graves' smirk wavered. Elijah's breath hitched. For the first time since this trial began, the energy in the room shifted. But if Naomi had expected Whitmore to be shaken, she was mistaken. The judge's smirk didn't disappear. If anything, it deepened. He let the silence stretch, absorbing the tension, savoring the weight of the moment. Then, with the ease of a man who had seen every kind of challenge and crushed them all, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled a slow, deliberate sigh. "A federal agent," he mused, shaking his head slightly. He let out a soft chuckle, the sound low and mocking. "Well, now, that's adorable." His eyes locked onto Naomi's, and for a moment, there was nothing but amusement in them. "So, tell me, Agent Carter," he continued, rolling the title off his tongue like it was a joke. "Do you think flashing a badge is enough to overturn legal proceedings? Or did you have something else planned? Perhaps a dramatic speech about justice?" His tone was light, dismissive, like he was indulging a child who didn't know better. Naomi didn't move. She had expected arrogance, expected resistance, but what she hadn't expected was how comfortable he was. He wasn't angry, he wasn't flustered, he was entertained, which meant only one thing: he had been challenged before, and he had always won. Whitmore flicked his gaze toward the jury as if letting them in on the joke. Then he turned back to her, shaking his head. "I've seen many things in my courtroom," he mused, his voice almost lazy. "But this? A Secret Service agent attempting to disrupt a fair and legal trial?" His smirk widened. "Now that is new." The words hung in the air for a beat before he delivered the final blow. "Officer," he said smoothly, barely even looking toward the bailiff, "place Miss Carter under arrest. Charge her with obstruction of justice." The courtroom collectively inhaled. Elijah surged forward in his seat. "Wait, what? What?" "Sit down," Douglas warned him, gripping his arm. His voice was firm, but Naomi could hear the tension beneath it. The uniformed officers near the back hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Still, Naomi didn't flinch. She just smiled. And for the first time that day, Whitmore hesitated. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of something in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. Because deep down, something in him knew this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. The two uniformed officers moved toward Naomi, their steps measured, cautious. Not aggressive, uncertain. The courtroom held its breath, the weight of what was happening sinking in like a slow, suffocating tide. Above it all, Judge Lucas Whitmore sat unmoved, watching her like a man who had already won. His smirk, slow and knowing, hadn't faltered once. "Agent Carter," he said, as if the title meant nothing. "You are in contempt of this court. You can come quietly or—" Then it happened. A voice cut through the air, sharp and unrelenting. "Make sure Carter doesn't walk out of here a free man. I don't care what you have to do. He needs to be convicted." The courtroom froze. The officers stopped mid-step. Whitmore's smirk faltered. The recording continued. "This trial is not about the truth. It's about control. We set the narrative. We shape the verdict. The jury will see what we want them to see." A ripple of unease passed through the room. A few jurors exchanged glances, their once passive expressions now etched with something dangerously close to doubt. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys, unsure whether to keep typing. Graves had gone pale. His hands gripped the edge of the prosecution's table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his gaze darting between Naomi, Whitmore, and the officers. He was calculating, scrambling. But there was no escape from this. Not anymore. The officers who had been ordered to arrest Naomi hesitated. Their hands hovered near their belts, but none of them moved forward. Because now they weren't sure who the real criminal was. Naomi turned her gaze to Whitmore. For the first time that day, he was shaken. His arrogance, his confidence, so perfectly controlled before, began to crack. Not all at once. Not visibly. But Naomi saw it. The way his fingers curled against the bench, tightening. The way his breathing changed. Still measured, but deeper now, heavier. The way his smirk, so carefully crafted, flickered for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "Turn that off." His voice was sharp, commanding, but there was something else woven beneath it. Panic. No one moved. The recording played on. "Judge Whitmore will ensure this case goes exactly as planned. He always does." That was the final blow. It wasn't just about Elijah Carter anymore. It wasn't about resisting arrest. It was about a system rigged from the start. And now, they all knew it. Naomi didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just watched as the mighty Lucas Whitmore, a man who had ruled this courtroom like an untouchable king, finally realized he was no longer the one holding the gavel. Naomi didn't move. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, her posture relaxed, her eyes unwavering. And then, just as the last echoes of the recording faded into the thick, suffocating silence, she smiled. Not a smirk, not an arrogant grin. A slow, deliberate, razor-sharp smile. Whitmore's fingers curled against the bench, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. But still, he didn't speak. Not yet. He was weighing his options, running through every possible move he had left. Naomi could see it in his eyes. He was looking for a way out. She let the silence stretch a little longer, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter, watching as the officers exchanged hesitant glances. The jury whispered among themselves, and Graves, poor, ambitious Graves, sat there, frozen, as his world crumbled around him. And then she moved. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small flash drive. She turned it over in her fingers, casually, like it was nothing. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, controlled. "Interesting recording, isn't it?" she said. "Almost too perfect." She let the words settle, then walked forward, placing the drive on the evidence table. "But here's the thing," she continued, looking straight at Whitmore now. "It's fake." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Whitmore flinched, so small, so imperceptible that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Naomi did. She tapped a finger against the flash drive. "This contains the original, unedited version," she said. "The one they didn't want anyone to hear." She glanced at the judge. "You should know better than anyone, Your Honor, that technology can be manipulated." Whitmore's mouth opened as if to speak, but Naomi didn't give him the chance. "Unfortunately for you," she continued, "I don't deal in fabrications. I deal in truth." And then, as if the moment hadn't already shattered beyond repair, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Heads turned. A man entered. Older, broad-shouldered. His badge was gone, but the presence remained, a cop through and through. A man with a story to tell. Whitmore went rigid, because he knew exactly who this man was. Naomi turned slightly, gesturing toward him. "Meet Detective Raymond Holt," she said, her tone deceptively light. "Retired, formerly of the city's police force." She turned back to Whitmore, her smile still lingering. He has something to say, and I think you're going to want to hear it." The room pulsed with the weight of what was coming. Whitmore knew. He wasn't just losing control anymore. He had already lost. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. It was a reckoning. The jury had been out for only 30 minutes. It should have taken longer. It should have been harder. But after everything they had witnessed, the lies, the manipulation, the undeniable truth, there was only one verdict they could give. The foreperson stood, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She took a breath, steadying herself before speaking. "On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant." A pause. The kind that stretched just long enough to hold everyone captive. "Not guilty." The words landed like a thunderclap. Elijah exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his chest. Douglas clapped a firm hand on his back. Spectators murmured. The tension that had held the room hostage for hours finally snapped, breaking apart into a whirlwind of stunned reactions. Naomi? She didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because she wasn't done. Her gaze never left Whitmore. He was still seated, still gripping his gavel, as if holding it tightly enough might somehow allow him to regain control. His face was pale, the last traces of arrogance draining from him as reality set in. Then a voice rang out. "Judge Whitmore," a court official announced, stepping forward. "As of this moment, you are placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation." A rustle of shock swept through the courtroom. Whitmore's jaw clenched. It was over. His career, his reputation, his legacy. Naomi tilted her head slightly, watching him. Men like Whitmore didn't fear losing power. They feared what came after. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. But as satisfying as it was to watch a corrupt judge crumble, Naomi had already moved on to her next target. Across the room, Martin Graves had begun gathering his things, slipping his files into his briefcase with a careful, measured speed. A man trying not to look like he was running. Naomi smiled. He was smart, just not smart enough, because he wasn't getting away. Not today. Not ever. The sound of footsteps echoed through the courtroom as uniformed officers entered, their presence undeniable, their purpose clear. Whitmore's grip on his gavel tightened. This was not how his day was supposed to end. For years, he had ruled over this courtroom like an untouchable force. A king disguised as a judge. His decisions had never been questioned, his verdicts never challenged. He had shaped the system, bent it to his will. And now, the same system he had wielded like a weapon was turning against him. One of the officers stepped forward. "Judge Whitmore," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "You are under arrest. Please stand and place your hands where we can see them." Whitmore's jaw clenched. He didn't move. He wouldn't. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. The jury. The press. The people who had once feared him, respected him. His entire world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Unless... His eyes snapped to Naomi, and for the first time, the calm, calculating judge exploded. "You think this is over?" he bellowed, his voice slicing through the tension. "You think one trial, one case changes anything?" The officers tensed, readying themselves in case he resisted. Whitmore didn't resist. But he wasn't done talking. "This system will grind you down, Naomi Carter. You think you've won something here?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're a fool if you think this is justice. You've only scratched the surface. The system is bigger than you, bigger than all of us, and it will crush you." The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone was watching Naomi, waiting. She didn't move. She didn't react. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, her presence unshakable. And that was what broke him. Not the verdict, not the arrest, not even the humiliation. It was the way she looked at him, cold, unbothered, as if he were already nothing. Whitmore's breath hitched. The officers stepped forward. This time he didn't fight them. He just let it happen. Because deep down, he knew. Naomi Carter had already won. The chaos had settled. The gavel, once a symbol of Whitmore's power, now sat abandoned on the bench. The courtroom, once his domain, had become the stage of his downfall. Elijah stood beside Naomi, his eyes still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He was free. But freedom, he was learning, came with its own kind of burden. He glanced at his sister, studying the way she stood, calm, composed, as if this was just another step in a much longer road. Finally, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the moment Whitmore was taken away. What now? Naomi exhaled, slow and steady. Her gaze drifted beyond the courtroom, beyond the people still whispering, beyond the walls that had once imprisoned men like Elijah under the weight of injustice. Then she smiled. It was small, subtle. But it wasn't an expression of victory. It was the kind of smile that came when you saw the battle ahead and stepped forward anyway. He was right about one thing, she murmured. Elijah frowned. Who? Whitmore. She turned to face him fully, her eyes sharp, unwavering. Bookmark. I've only just begun. The screen faded to black, and in the silence that followed, one question remained. Was justice truly served, or was this only the beginning of a war far greater than anyone had imagined? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and resilience. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our passion to keep bringing you stories that matter. Every like, every comment, every share helps us continue this journey. So what do you think? Is this the beginning of real change, or just another battle in a long fight? Let us know in the comments below. Top of form, bottom of form.